The Mediterranean breeze drifted through the sheer curtains of the majestic hotel suite, carrying the faint murmur of the Cannes nightlife. Leopold lay perfectly still on the silk sheets, eyes closed, his breathing slow and measured. Beside him, the faint, bluish glow of a smartphone screen illuminated the sharp, beautiful profile of his wife, Persephone. She thought he was deeply asleep. She didn't know he could hear every hushed, venomous word she whispered into the receiver, words that didn't just break his heart, but threatened to destroy his entire legacy. If you enjoy stories of dark secrets and cinematic revenge, subscribe to our channel and walk this red carpet of betrayal with us. The rhythmic shushing of the Mediterranean waves against the Croisette should have been a lullaby. Instead, it was the soundtrack to the methodical dismantling of Leopold's life. He lay on the right side of the king-sized bed in the penthouse suite of the majestic Barrier, his chest rising and falling in the deep, even cadence of profound sleep. It was a performance, arguably the greatest directing job of his career. His eyes were shut, but behind the lids, his mind was screaming. Less than 2 feet away, the woman who had been his muse, his wife, and the center of his artistic universe for 5 years was perched on the edge of the mattress. Persephone's silhouette was outlined by the cold, bluish light of her smartphone. The screen's glare caught the flawless curve of her cheekbone, the same cheekbone that would be projected onto a 50-foot screen at the Paletta festivals in less than 48 hours. She held the phone close to her lips, her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that barely pierced the ambient noise of the hotel room. But Leopold's hearing was a filmmaker's hearing, trained to catch the slightest dissonance in an audio mix. "I know, darling," Persephone murmured, the affection in her tone slicing through the dark room like a scalpel. It was a tone she hadn't used with Leopold in months. "He's dead to the world. The sleeping pills I slipped into his wine worked perfectly." Leopold felt a cold bead of sweat trace a slow path down his spine. The heavy, lethargic feeling in his limbs suddenly made horrifying sense. He had barely managed to fight off the chemical undertow, waking up just minutes ago to the vibration of her phone. "The premiere is on Thursday," Persephone continued, her voice tightening with a sudden, pragmatic edge that replaced the lover's warmth. "Julian, you have to ensure the transfer paperwork is buried in the press embargo agreements. Once the credits roll, the intellectual property clause kicks in. He'll be too busy popping champagne to realize he's just signed over the entire distribution rights to us." A sickening jolt hit Leopold's stomach. Julian, his co-producer, his closest friend in the ruthless machine of the industry. He dug his fingernails into the meat of his palms, hidden beneath the thick duvet, using the physical pain to anchor him. He couldn't move. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. If he snapped now, in the middle of the night, it would be a messy, emotional confrontation. They would deny it. They would pivot. They would destroy his magnum opus before it even saw the light of a projector. "I can't wait to be done with this," Persephone whispered softly, a cruel laugh escaping her lips. Playing the adoring wife to a fading auteur is exhausting. "Thursday night, Julian. Thursday night, we take it all." She ended the call, the blue light fading to black. The mattress shifted as she slid back beneath the covers, turning her back to him. The scent of her expensive jasmine perfume drifted over him, suddenly cloying and suffocating. Leopold kept his breathing steady, inhaling the ashes of his marriage. The darkness of the room felt absolute, but as he stared at the faint shadows on the ceiling, a cold, cinematic clarity washed over him. She wanted a dramatic ending. He was going to give her a masterpiece. The morning sun over the French Riviera was blindingly bright, a stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating darkness that had settled deep within Leopold's chest. He woke to the scent of freshly brewed espresso and warm croissants. Persephone was already up, sitting on the terrace in a pristine white silk robe, her dark hair perfectly, elegantly tousled. She looked every inch the European cinema icon, turning toward him with a smile so radiant and seemingly genuine that it briefly short-circuited his brain. "Good morning, my genius," she purred, holding out a delicate porcelain cup. "You slept like the dead." I was almost jealous. Leopold forced the corners of his mouth upward, accepting the coffee. His hand trembled slightly, a subtle betrayal of his nerves, which he quickly masked by taking a long sip of the scalding liquid. Pre-premiere exhaustion, I suppose, he rasped, his voice rough from a night spent staring at the ceiling. It all catches up to you eventually. Every primal instinct in his body screamed at him to hurl the hot espresso against the pristine glass of their suite's balcony, to demand answers, to tear down the facade. But his dilemma was absolute. If he confronted her now, he would give Julian the crucial window needed to finalize the legal theft of his magnum opus. To save his life's work, he had to swallow the bitter bile in his throat and play the oblivious fool. He chose the agonizing path. He chose the long game. I have back-to-back interviews with the international press all afternoon, Persephone announced, glancing at her diamond-encrusted watch. Julian is coming up here first to go over the talking points. You should probably head to the Palais to check the theater's audio mixing one last time. You know how obsessive you get about the low frequencies. It was the perfect, textbook excuse to clear him from the board. Leopold nodded, adopting the persona of the distracted, socially inept auteur to absolute perfection. He showered in agonizingly hot water, dressed in his signature black linen suit, and methodically packed his leather messenger bag. But before zipping it shut, he opened a velvet-lined case. Inside was a high-end, impossibly small lavalier microphone, a piece of technology usually reserved for capturing intimate, unscripted dialogue on chaotic film sets. While Persephone was occupied in the master bathroom, the shower running at full volume, Leopold moved through the suite with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a seasoned grip. He approached the velvet chaise lounge in the living area, knowing it was her preferred spot for commanding the room during meetings. With practiced, steady fingers, he wedged the tiny transmitter deep into the crease of the upholstery, burying it out of sight, but perfectly positioned to capture pristine audio. He synced the frequency to a secure, encrypted recording app on his phone. He was no longer just a broken man. He was a director framing the opening shot of his own tragedy. As he left the suite, he crossed paths with Julian in the opulent hallway. The co-producer offered a sickeningly warm, fraternal embrace. Leopold returned the gesture, patting Julian's back, feeling the hollow space where a friend used to be. The moment the elevator doors closed behind him, Leopold tapped his phone screen. The tape was rolling. The afternoon press junket was held in the glittering Belle Epoque salon of the Carlton Hotel, a sea of microphones, ring lights, and aggressively cheerful journalists. Leopold sat rigidly beside Persephone on a velvet love seat, the physical proximity to her feeling like a slow-acting poison in his veins. She was a masterclass in public relations. She laughed at the exact right moments, tilted her head to catch the optimal lighting, and frequently reached out to rest her manicured hand over his. Every time her warm skin brushed against his knuckles, Leopold had to suppress a visceral shudder. The cameras flashed incessantly, freezing the illusion of the definitive cinematic power couple into digital permanence. Leopold's vision is what drew me to this project, Persephone told a reporter from a major Parisian daily, her voice dripping with manufactured reverence. She turned her dark, expressive eyes toward him, the picture of absolute devotion. He doesn't just direct, he excavates the soul. Being his wife and his lead actress, it is the privilege of my life. We are entirely intertwined. Leopold managed a tight, modest smile, nodding for the cameras. Inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket, his smartphone felt as heavy as a block of lead. The secure app had stopped recording 2 hours ago, automatically uploading the audio file from the hotel suite to his private cloud. He hadn't listened to it yet. He had been trapped in the relentless machinery of festival promotion, forced to swallow her public adulation while agonizing over the private treason it masked. The dissonance was giving him a blinding migraine. The stifling air of the salon suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. "Excuse me," Leopold murmured, his voice tight but controlled. He patted Persephone's hand gently, executing a perfect counterperformance. "Just a moment. The heat in here is a bit much." He navigated through the throng of reporters, his expression fixed in a polite mask until he reached the heavy oak doors of the men's restroom at the far end of the corridor. Pushing inside, he locked the door, leaning his forehead against the cool marble of the sink. He took a ragged breath, the scent of expensive hotel soap doing nothing to settle his rolling stomach. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his phone and a single wireless earbud. He pressed it into his ear, opened the secure directory, and tapped play on the morning's recording. At first, there was only the rustle of fabric, the ambient hum of the suite's air conditioning. Then, the sharp clinking of glassware. He bought it completely. Julian's voice drifted through the tiny speaker, laced with a smug, casual arrogance. He's at the Palais obsessing over decibel levels. Thank God, Persephone sighed. I can only stomach the tortured genius routine for so long in one day. Do you have the final draft of the transfer? It's buried in the international distribution contracts, Julian confirmed. When the credits roll Thursday, you serve him the divorce papers. The shock will paralyze him. By Friday morning, the IP defaults to our offshore LLC. Leopold gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles turning white. Then came the sentence that froze the blood in his veins, hinting at a darkness deeper than a simple affair. 5 years, Persephone whispered, her tone utterly devoid of human warmth. 5 years of playing his devoted little extra just to get my hands on this specific property. Make sure the paperwork is bulletproof, Julian. I am not leaving empty-handed after half a decade of this exhausting audition. Leopold stared at his own pale reflection in the mirror, the chill of her words echoing in his skull. His marriage wasn't just over. It had never been real in the first place. The realization that his entire 5-year marriage had been a calculated performance left Leopold feeling hollowed out, akin to walking onto a film set where all the props were made of painted cardboard. The devastation had crystallized into an icy, impenetrable resolve. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted the total annihilation of Persephone's carefully curated image and Julian's corrupt career. To orchestrate a spectacle of that magnitude, he needed a megaphone. He needed the press. More specifically, he needed Beatrix. Beatrix was a legendary, acerbic film critic for the most influential arts publication in Europe. She was known for her razor-sharp reviews and an almost pathological intolerance for industry bullshit. More importantly, she harbored a well-documented, long-standing vendetta against Julian, who had once tanked an independent director's career, a director Beatrix fiercely championed, through shady financial maneuvers. Leopold spotted her at the Chopard rooftop party that evening. She was holding court near the open bar, a glass of gin in one hand, her signature oversized dark glasses pushed up into her silver hair. She cut a striking, intimidating figure amidst the sycophants and rising stars. He detached himself from Persephone, who was currently charming a group of Italian distributors, excusing himself with a vague murmur about needing air. He moved through the crowd with purpose, intercepting Beatrix just as she turned away from a breathless young actor. "Beatrix," Leopold said softly, leaning into her personal space just enough to avoid shouting over the thumping bass of the DJ. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, assessing his pale, rigid face. "Leopold, you look like a man walking to the gallows, not the red carpet. The buzz on your picture is deafening. Don't tell me you've lost your nerve." "I need your help," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the din. "Not with a review. With an execution." Beatrix's eyes narrowed, her cynical amusement fading into sharp interest. She scrutinized him for a long moment, reading the terrifying calm beneath his composed exterior. "I'm listening. Walk with me." They moved away from the glittering center of the party, toward a shadowed corner of the terrace overlooking the marina, where the mega-yachts bobbed gently in the dark water. Leopold didn't waste time with pleasantries or self-pity. He pulled his smartphone from his inner pocket, navigating to the secure folder, and handed it to her. "I recorded this in my suite this morning. Press play." Beatrix took the device, eyeing him suspiciously before slipping a single, elegant earbud into her ear. She tapped the screen. For a minute, the only sound between them was the clinking of ice in her glass. Then, as she heard Julian and Persephone's damning conversation, her posture stiffened. The subtle tightening of her jaw was the only physical reaction she allowed herself. When the audio file concluded, she slowly removed the earbud, handing the phone back to Leopold. Her dark eyes were unreadable in the dim light of the terrace. "They're going to steal the intellectual property of my magnum opus and serve me divorce papers the moment the credits roll on Thursday," Leopold stated flatly, the words tasting like ash. Julian buried the transfer clauses in the international distribution agreements. "They are arrogant, greedy amateurs," Beatrix whispered, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of her mouth. "And you, Leopold, are a ruthless bastard for recording your own wife. I respect it immensely." "I don't just want to stop the theft, Beatrix," Leopold said, leaning closer, the smell of her expensive gin sharp in his nose. "I want to bury them both. Publicly. Irrevocably. But I need someone with the reach and the venom to ensure the narrative is controlled the second the bomb goes off." Beatrix took a slow sip of her drink, her gaze fixed on the distant lights of the Palais. "You provide the explosives, Leopold. I will ensure the shockwave levels the entire Croisette." The Palais de Festivals loomed large and imposing under the Wednesday afternoon sun, an architectural titan built for the worship of moving images. For Leopold, it had suddenly morphed from a sanctuary of art into an execution chamber. The Grand Lumiere Theatre, with its sprawling red velvet seats and state-of-the-art acoustics, was in the throes of a chaotic dress rehearsal. Julian, clutching a clipboard, barked at a frazzled stage manager in the center aisle, ensuring every lighting cue for the post-screening Q&A was flawless. Leopold stood near the back of the auditorium, his dark suit blending into the shadows beneath the balcony overhang. He watched Persephone, radiant even in a casual cashmere sweater, practicing her tearful, grateful bow on the massive stage. The contrast between her pristine performance and the venomous truth he carried on a flash drive deep in his pocket made him physically ill. The air in the theater felt thick, vibrating with the latent energy of a masterpiece about to debut and a life about to end. "Leopold," Julian shouted, waving from the orchestra pit, a grin splitting his handsome face. "The sound check is tight. The low frequencies on the opening sequence are going to blow the roof off this place." "Excellent," Leopold called back, his voice steady, projecting the calm, authoritative aura of a director who had everything under control. He gave a thumbs up, masking the tremor in his fingers. "I need to check the translation feeds in the booth. The international press needs pristine audio." "Go for it." Julian dismissed him, already turning back to his clipboard, entirely oblivious to the noose tightening around his neck. Leopold slipped through a heavy, soundproofed door marked Atch's Reserve at the rear of the theater. The concrete stairwell leading to the projection and audio control booths was dimly lit, echoing only with his own quiet footsteps. The air up here smelled of ozone and hot electronics. The audio technician, a wiry, exhausted-looking Frenchman named Luc, was hunched over an enormous mixing console illuminated by the glowing screens of a dozen monitors. He jumped slightly as Leopold entered the cramped, windowless room. "Monsieur Leopold," Luc stammered, removing his massive headphones. "Is there a problem with the mix?" "No, Luc. The mix is perfection," Leopold said softly, adopting a tone of intense confidentiality. He moved closer to the console, towering over the technician. "But there's a crucial change for the press screening. A final, experimental element I'm adding to the translation feed." Luc frowned, his eyes darting toward the complex digital routing matrix on the main screen. "A change now? The festival director will." "The festival director doesn't need to know," Leopold interrupted, pulling a sleek, encrypted USB drive from his pocket. He placed it gently on the console near Luc's right hand. "This is a secondary audio track. It's a thematic overlay designed specifically for the critics wearing the earpieces in the VIP section. It creates a dissonant, immersive experience meant to challenge the narrative of the film's climax." Luc looked completely lost, staring at the small, black piece of metal like it was a live grenade. I don't understand." You don't have to, Leopold replied, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, chilling murmur. He pointed to a specific channel fader on the board. You just have to route this file to the secondary translation channel, bypass the main auditorium speakers, and set it on a delayed trigger. Exactly 5 minutes into the third act, when the orchestral score swells during Persephone's final monologue. Leopold held Luke's gaze, leveraging every ounce of his imposing reputation. He was gambling heavily on the technician's reverence for a famous auteur's eccentricities. If this goes wrong, Luke began, his hand hovering over the keyboard. It won't, Leopold lied, stepping back toward the heavy door. Just load it, route it, and set the timer, Luke. Trust the director. He stepped back out into the stairwell, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The trap was set. Now, all he had to do was survive the premiere. The Thursday afternoon air in Cannes felt thick, charged with the electric anticipation of a major premiere, but inside Leopold's isolated hotel suite, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. The blackout curtains were drawn tight against the Mediterranean sun, plunging the room into an artificial, suffocating twilight. Persephone had already left for her extensive hair and makeup appointments, her parting kiss on his cheek leaving a phantom, freezing burn. Leopold sat alone at the heavy mahogany desk, the only illumination coming from the harsh white glow of his laptop screen. He had 2 hours before he needed to put on his tuxedo and step into the blinding flashbulbs of the Paletta festivals. 2 hours to harden his heart into absolute, unyielding obsidian. He needed to review the final cut of the audio file he had planted in the control booth. The file Beatrix was currently priming her editorial team to dissect the moment it detonated. He plugged his professional-grade headphones into the laptop, the heavy leather cups sealing him off from the world. He opened the decrypted folder containing the raw recordings from the hidden lavalier microphone over the past 3 days. He had already edited the most damning conversation between Persephone and Julian into a devastating 3-minute track, but a morbid, self-destructive curiosity compelled him to listen to the unedited remnants. He needed to know the full extent of the rot. He clicked on a file time-stamped late Wednesday night, shortly after he had returned from rigging the audio booth. He had been in the shower. Persephone had been in the bedroom, presumably alone. At first, there was only the sound of a zipper, the rustle of a garment bag, and then the distinct, rhythmic tapping of a manicured finger against a glass table. Then, Persephone's voice, low and breathless, humming a melody. It was the haunting, melancholic theme song from his film, the very song that played over the climax he had written specifically for her. Leopold's breath hitched in his throat. The humming stopped. God, it's brilliant, Persephone whispered to herself, the audio crisp and intimate. He really is a genius. A pathetic, predictable genius. Leopold froze, his hand hovering over the trackpad. The sheer malice in her isolated voice was more terrifying than her conversations with Julian. 5 years, she continued, a chilling, triumphant laugh echoing in the quiet room. 5 years of pretending to love his neuroses, his obsession with framing, his tedious need for emotional validation. But look at this dress. Look at this role. Leopold felt the blood drain from his face, a cold sweat breaking across his forehead. This wasn't just a recent affair born of Hollywood temptation or a sudden, greedy land grab for intellectual property. This was an excavation of his entire reality. I remember the day I met him, she murmured, the sound of ice clinking against glass indicating she was pouring a drink. I saw the script for the Obsidian tier on his desk at that awful indie party in Soho. I knew instantly it was an Oscar winner. I just had to convince him I was the only woman who could bleed for it. It took exactly 3 weeks to make him fall in love. It was the easiest audition of my life. Leopold slammed his fist onto the desk, the impact vibrating through the wood, but he didn't stop the recording. He forced himself to listen to the autopsy of his own soul. Tomorrow night, she whispered, her voice dark with anticipation. I wear the diamonds, I cry on cue for the standing ovation, I serve the papers, and I take the kingdom. Julian is just the lawyer in a nice suit. Leopold built the throne, but I am the queen. The recording clicked off, plunging Leopold into a profound, ringing silence. The twist was a knife twisting deep in his gut. She had never loved him. Not for a single second. The marriage, the passion, the whispered confessions in the dark. It was all just extensive method acting. He slowly removed his headphones, the silence of the suite pressing in on him. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. The devastation was too absolute for something as simple as tears. He stood up, his face a pale, rigid mask of absolute resolve. He walked to the closet and pulled out his tuxedo. The time for sorrow was over. It was time for the premiere. The red carpet of the Paletta Festivals was a blinding gauntlet of flashbulbs, screaming fans, and the aggressive hum of international media. Leopold walked it like a man moving underwater, his face a perfectly composed mask of auteurish distance. Beside him, Persephone was a vision in custom Givenchy, her smile dazzling, her hand lightly resting on his arm, a physical contact that now felt like a localized burn. Julian trailed them, his tuxedo impeccable, his eyes scanning the crowd with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won the festival and the film's rights. Beatrix was already seated inside the Lumiere Theater, positioned strategically in the VIP press section, her sharp eyes fixed on the stage. The 2-hour runtime of the Obsidian tier felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast. Leopold sat rigidly in the center orchestra seat, the velvet upholstery warm against his back. Persephone sat to his right, occasionally leaning over to whisper manufactured endearments into his ear, her performance flawless even in the dark. Julian was seated 2 rows behind them. On screen, the narrative hurtled toward its devastating climax. The entire auditorium was dead silent, the audience completely captivated by Persephone's raw, on-screen breakdown, a performance Leopold now knew was merely the rehearsal for her real-life betrayal. The scene shifted to the film's crucial, quiet monologue. The sweeping orchestral score began its slow, melancholic swell. This was the moment. The 5-minute mark into the third act. Leopold's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't look at Persephone. He stared straight ahead at the massive screen, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. In the VIP section, 200 of the world's most influential critics, buyers, and journalists were wearing translation earpieces. Suddenly, a violent shudder rippled through the press corps. It started with a few sharp intakes of breath from the French critics near Beatrix. Then, a prominent American journalist yanked his earpiece out, his eyes wide with shock, staring directly at the back of Leopold and Persephone's heads. A low murmur, completely at odds with the solemnity of the on-screen action, began to spread like a contagion through the darkened theater. The translation feed had cut out. In its place, pumped directly into the ears of the most powerful people in the industry, was the pristine, undeniable audio of Leopold's hidden lavalier microphone. 5 years of pretending to love his neuroses. I just had to convince him I was the only woman who could bleed for it. It was the easiest audition of my life. The sound of Persephone's cold, calculating voice echoed in the tiny speakers, layered agonizingly over her on-screen character's tearful confession of love. When the credits roll Thursday, you serve him the divorce papers. By Friday morning, the IP defaults to our offshore LLC. Julian's arrogant confirmation followed, a brutal counterpoint to the swelling violins. The murmur in the theater swelled into a chaotic, undeniable buzz of scandal. People were leaning over seats, whispering frantically, pointing toward the center aisle. Cell phone screens flared to life in the darkness as reporters instinctively began drafting the most explosive scoop of the decade. Persephone, oblivious to the audio feed playing only in the headsets, finally noticed the strange, restless energy of the room. She frowned, turning her head slightly, her perfect cinematic illusion faltering. "What is happening?" she whispered sharply to Leopold. "Why are they talking?" Leopold slowly turned his head. He looked at the woman he had loved, the woman who had never existed. His face was entirely devoid of emotion, a blank canvas upon which she could read her own sudden, terrifying destruction. "They are listening, Persephone," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that barely carried over the rising noise of the auditorium. "To the real masterpiece." He saw the exact moment the realization hit her. Her eyes widened, the blood draining instantly from her face, leaving her pale and stark beneath the glow of the silver screen. She looked wildly toward the press section, where Beatrix was already typing furiously on her phone, her ruthless smile illuminated by the screen. Behind them, Julian let out a strangled, panicked sound, half rising from his seat as he finally grasped the magnitude of the disaster. The trap had closed. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. The Lumiere Theatre was no longer a sanctuary of art. It was a coliseum, and the lions had just been released. The low murmur of the press corps had erupted into a chaotic, undeniable clamor. Cell phones were raised like lit torches in the gloom, their camera lenses trained not on the massive screen, but on the center orchestra section where the illusion of the festival's golden couple was violently dissolving. Persephone's breathing hitched, her hand flying to her throat, as if she were suddenly choking on the rarefied air of the Palais. The pristine, tragic mask she wore in the film was entirely obliterated by the stark, raw panic contorting her features. She looked frantically toward the VIP section, where Beatrix, bathed in the harsh glow of her laptop, gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement to Leopold. The review was already live, the audio file attached, the headline undoubtedly a kill shot to two careers. "Leopold." Persephone gasped, her voice shrill, clawing at the sleeve of his tuxedo. "What have you done?" "The audio, the feed, you." Leopold did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed firmly ahead, watching the final, silent moments of his film play out. His heart, which had hammered so violently in his chest for 3 days, had settled into a slow, cold rhythm. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a profound, icy clarity. Behind them, Julian let out a sound that was half curse, half sob. He was scrambling over the legs of bewildered minor producers, desperate to reach the aisle, desperate to find an exit before the lights came up and the full weight of the industry's judgment fell upon him. "You're destroying the film," Persephone hissed, her desperation warping into sudden, venomous anger. She leaned in, her meticulously applied makeup stark against her pale skin. "You're destroying everything we built." "I am merely editing the narrative, Persephone," Leopold replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that barely carried over the rising noise of the auditorium. It was the voice of a director giving a final note to a difficult actor. "The film belongs to me. You were just a prop." The final credits began to roll, white text scrolling against a stark black background. The melancholic theme song, the one she had hummed with such calculated malice in their suite, swelled through the main speakers, a deeply ironic accompaniment to the chaos in the seats. This was the moment she had planned to serve him the divorce papers. The moment she had planned to take everything. Instead, Leopold stood up slowly. He smoothed the lapels of his jacket with steady, deliberate movements. The sudden movement drew the immediate attention of a dozen flashing cameras. The noise in the theater reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of shouted questions and frantic whispers. Persephone stared up at him, her eyes wide, entirely stripped of her cinematic armor. For the first time in 5 years, Leopold saw the real woman beneath the performance, small, terrified, and utterly exposed. He reached into his pocket, but he did not pull out a legal document or a microphone. He reached for his left hand. With a smooth, practiced motion, he slid the heavy platinum wedding band off his ring finger. The metal felt cold against his skin, suddenly heavy with the weight of a half-decade lie. He didn't throw it at her. He didn't offer a final, dramatic monologue. Leopold gently placed the ring onto the deep red velvet of his empty seat. It sat there, a tiny, glittering monument to a masterpiece built on a lie. He turned his back on her, on Julian's retreating figure, and on the flashing cameras. He walked up the center aisle, his stride long and even, the shadows of the exit doors stretching out to meet him. He didn't look back as he pushed through the heavy, soundproof doors into the cool, quiet concrete of the lobby, leaving the screaming chaos of the theater behind him. The credits are rolling, Persephone, and your screen time is over.